Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Tranter model of 1868, or at least one of the versions thereof. A compact version. Let's zoom in so you can see it in the lightbox. Weighing just 1½ pounds with an overall length of 8.1 inches, this is the most compact revolver we've seen in our series yet. This particular version has a 5-shot cylinder, although as we'll see, 6 was more common. It chambers the 450 Adams cartridge, loading and unloading through a right-hand gate. This episode wouldn't be possible if not for help from our friends at Rock Island Auction, College Hill Arsenal, and the Royal Armories, because all of them permitted us to use images in describing the myriad of models featured in today's history lesson. We thank them, and you should thank them too. Now I'm just going to set down this little darling for the moment because today's episode represents the research equivalent of sorting through your spare cables drawer of 10 years worth of hoarding. That's because I need to finally get down to the basic explanation of the unsung hero of Birmingham small arms history. I should also probably explain Birmingham small arms history. Located in England, just about 120 miles northwest of London, Birmingham's access to metal ore and coal made it a natural site for a manufacturing town. Not unlike the Eibar region of Spain, actually. And by the end of the 16th century, there are already known records of weapons manufacture and export. With the further development of firearms technology, Birmingham metalsmiths would of course morph into gunsmiths, and as the centuries turned, a sort of cultural macro factory emerged. Here's how it works. John makes locks, Bob fits stocks, and Harry, well, he produces loading rods on down the line. Now, of course, this sort of family shop division of labor is a more efficient way of producing arms, but only if those shops are physically close enough together in order to get parts back and forth. Which means, over time, people would actually move closer and closer together in order to make it more efficient, forming the gun quarter. Growing from the Wayman estate on the north side of town and wrapping around St. Mary's Church, this area began as the home of wealthy merchants and master gun makers, but eventually it transformed into workshops and factory buildings. Eventually the whole quarter acted as a sort of hive factory. Division of labor between families and shops meant that the Birmingham gun trade as a whole remained very flexible in good and bad times, and was capable, with a little financial incentive, of producing thousands or even hundreds of thousands of arms in very short order when called upon. Further collaboration between the biggest players brought about their own private proof house, which later would be established by law in order to avoid having to truck government orders back and forth to London for proofing. This proved a wise decision because in the 19th century, Birmingham's arms production had already overtaken the London manufacturers. Alright, that's a basic groundwork for the region, and it ebbs and flows depending on warfare or peace for years and years. One noteworthy point, though, Birmingham often managed sales even when Mother Britain was in a rare state of peace. This was accomplished by becoming a world-renowned source for clones of martial arms, meaning the Birmingham Smiths were highly adaptable and often very up-to-date on firearms technology, even when their manufacturing methods might not necessarily be so. Now, our episode today is actually about an almost purely commercial, practically pocket-sized revolver. However, despite its diminutive appearance, it was developed and produced by one of the biggest names in Birmingham at the time, William Tranter. Born in Oldbury, Worcester, England, William was the eldest of what would be 9 children born to Thomas and Mary Tranter. Now, his father had been a blacksmith, but William was named for his uncle, William Tranter, who we believe was in the gun trade, providing ramrods to the Board of Ordnance and probably more. Now, likely because of his uncle, young William would start an apprenticeship to the gun-making firm of Hollis Brothers and Company in nearby Birmingham. Following his tutelage, William apparently received a sum of money, again from his uncle, and I've seen this worded a few ways. It may have been that the uncle passed away without heirs, or maybe a portion of it went down to him, or maybe it was a gift by a living man. There's not a lot of detail on the uncle, unfortunately. Regardless of how, William was now able, in 1839, to buy out Robert Dugard's shop at 29 1/2 Whittle Street. In 1844, he would go into business with his former bosses at Hollis over at 11 Wayman Street, though this was dissolved just 5 years later. On his own again, he would move to 13 St. Mary's Row, a property he would retain until 1875, and took on his younger brother David to help manage the business. Here, it seems, he began licensed production of the very successful Adams revolver. Robert Adams' 1851 patented percussion revolver to be exact, a double-action only, muzzle-loading, black powder handgun that competed more than competently with the Colt Navy in the British market. Adams' revolver was more popular than his ability to produce it, so Tranter would be employed not only making clones, but also producing frames and other parts for Adams' own assembly. You can actually sometimes find a Adams revolver with the WT William Tranter marking under the grips. Now, this is another point to make note of early in the story. Birmingham Smiths were very familiar with licensing patent rights from one another, especially. Now, as a competent producer of the Adams, Tranter was seeing brisk sales and was already a successful manufacturer. However, as his wealth grew, he made even further investments, especially in real estate, so much so that it's likely the bulk of his eventual wealth didn't come from his occupation, but rather from his role as a landlord or later sales of various holdings. But we're here to talk about his revolvers, and there is some evidence that he had already patented a modification of a pepper box design earlier in life, but this and any other minor developments pale in comparison to what probably remains his most iconic piece of work. Known as the dual trigger revolver, Tranter's 1853 patent covered a lower trigger that could be pulled rearward to cock the action, just like the hammer's original spur. Then, pressing the normally positioned trigger fired the pistol. In a pinch, you could also just pull both at once for rapid fire, kind of like a double action. A commercial success, these double-trigger Tranters kept their own following throughout the percussion era, and eventually evolved through a number of changes, which we won't go into detail for on this episode. Well, at least not until the last variation, which was the most significant. Commonly known to collectors as the 4th model Tranter, this pistol really represents a whole new gun in my eyes. Single trigger, modern single or double action operation. This design was introduced in 1856 and patented the same year. It covers 3 distinct mechanisms, however the actual executed action was more of a hybrid of these 2 mechanisms, plus some minor updating, and we'll see it used in our pistol today. Both the single and double trigger mechanisms would also be produced in a unique frame, which made use of a Kerr patent loading ram and a horizontally aligned central arbor pin retaining spring. We'll see some of these styling points come up later. Proving to be popular, Tranter's revolvers enabled him to buy further facilities, this time at 50 Loveday Street, and that same year, William Tranter became a founding member of the Birmingham Small Arms Trade Association of Gun Makers. One of the primary goals of this organization was to control the flow of military contract gun work in the gun quarter, setting and negotiating prices together and working out internal deals on who did what for how much of the action. Most members of the same group, including Tranter, would actually go on to found the Birmingham Small Arms Company Limited as Birmingham's response to both London organization and the RSAF Enfield facility, although this is not part of our story today. Being a major player in the industry, Tranter was plugged into a network of retailers who purchased his product, often marketed as their own, and then resold it. And his revolvers were so well regarded, this network extended on into the Americas, particularly 2 businesses in New Orleans, which made his revolvers popular even in the agrarian South. This proved to be, again, profitable when Civil War were declared. Lasting from 1861 into 1865, the disunited States Civil War pitted the agrarian South against the industrialized North. Without going into too much detail, the North had their own problems which necessitated buying abroad for a time, but the Confederacy struggled with its limited industrial power and would remain a strong importer of arms throughout the entire conflict. This proved particularly profitable to Tranter as he managed to make a connection with Southern buying agents. Even before the war was over, Tranter purchased the vacant lot at 31 Litchfield Road in Aston Cross, which is why it doesn't fit in our map. The land would, several years later, be developed into a massive factory complex, but it probably doesn't factor into our story today. I say probably because the immediate precursor to our revolver was developed before construction was started on that facility. Also, this particular revolver lineage retains a certain handmade charm that doesn't seem to apply to the very next model. So while I have no proof of what I am saying at the moment, I suspect they continued to be made at the smaller facility still under Tranter's control, even though the larger factory had been built. Again, even as the US Civil War raged, Tranter was inventing and adapting though. Known to collectors as the 1863 Army, as it appeared to be geared towards military adoption, although none was achieved. We'll later see that the British Army was very slow on this matter. If we look at the gun, we can see some lingering influence from the Tranter Kerr, like the horizontal arbor latch. 6-shot and chambering the 4.42 rimfire cartridge, which was developed to use the existing 54-bore barrels. These were mostly triple-action revolvers, meaning single or double. However, a small number of single-action onlys are known to exist. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to bum a photo of the other side of that Army model, but all we're really missing is a shot of its unique ejector, which was covered in patent number 1862 of 1863. Using a compound lever, the head of this ejector was designed to make contact with the case mouth, preventing early, easily damaged rimfire brass from tearing on ejection. Now this is where things get a bit confusing because a number of features start to come and go very quickly, as do a number of revolvers. Making his way into cartridge loading designs, Tranter would apparently experiment fairly wildly in his batch production. Combined with his scant marketing and lack of using model designations, it can be pretty confusing to unpack all of his designs and properly label them. This can get even more confusing when you take into account how the batch production in Birmingham as a whole usually went. Lots of these British-made solid frame revolvers appear very similar, and there's a good reason. It was common for various smiths to buy their forged frames from the same handful of producers. The frames were then cut out and further shaped to their own mechanisms and tastes. But that core family resemblance obviously remains. Also, various patent features were constantly being licensed back and forth, and you end up with a sort of macro product family. So despite the individual trade names, these are all revolvers of the Birmingham Hive factory system. With Tranter as one of the larger players, features from his guns obviously leaked down into many of the others, not just from licensed copy, but also because he wasn't the usual sort of man we see in our history series. Men like, say, Samuel Colt whipped their companies along with showboating, aggressive marketing, and over-promising. They leveraged artificial reputation into raw investor capital and then burned that in a rabid attempt to barely meet expectations. Once established, they generally felt that they had made it and turned to developing an aura around their own story while settling into what usually becomes a predictable product evolution, if it evolves at all. William Tranter, however, seemed completely willing to let his name take a back seat. He used any idea he felt was worth licensing and developed a series of differing revolvers, likely in an attempt at both providing a wide selection but also divining around for the most preferred features. The vast majority of firearms produced by Tranter, to my understanding, didn't actually bear his name. Producing on contract for others, Tranter's marks were small, almost hidden, if they were even present at all. Even those purely commercial guns that were made entirely in-house and finished at his factories only tend to display a simple oval marking, Tranter's patent, marked on the side of the frame, usually over the barrel shank, leaving the billboard that was the barrel's top, or maybe a broad top strap space, available to any retailer to mark as they pleased. When he wasn't making whole guns, Tranter happily produced components for other smiths, often in those same large batches. So there are lots of Tranters out there that do not bear his name and generally add to the confusion for new collectors. If we just focused on true Tranters, those marked with his oval, even the experts have taken to roughly gathering them under different headings instead of a clear model name sometimes. But let's see if we can wrangle the core thrust of his product's evolution. Here is that single and double action 1863 Army model again. Just a reminder, this is a 6-shot revolver chambering the 4.42 rimfire cartridge. Like so many other bids at military adoption, it was failing to gain attention from the government, and so Tranter would adapt the best elements of the design into something more friendly to the civilian market. Scaling down to a 380 rimfire, or even down to 320, these more pocket-friendly revolvers are known to collectors as the House Defense line, although that name does seem to be applied to some later, more differenter pistols as well. The 1863 version that we care about is a 5-shot rimfire design using a single or double action The horn is usually on the frame instead of the trigger. More on that in a bit. A vertical spring bar retains the central arbor, and this little guy, that's a little flat spring which puts resistance on the cylinder to prevent counter-rotation when the trigger is released. There is no fixed ejector, although there usually was a separate one screwed into the butt. Over time, it seems the Army model would be dropped, or rather the one batch that was made was done, although it appears there might have been a couple little batches. And the response to the smaller 1863s must have been more positive because they would become the focus for further experimentation and modification. Towards the end of their production, we start to see some changes though. This is an image from Tranter's 1868 patent. It covers two features that would be applied to the late 1863s and the early versions of our revolver today. First, a firing pin mounted in the frame and a unique cupped safety hammer. This was quickly dropped from production and is rarely encountered today. However, at the front we see a spring-tensioned ejector rod, which would be used on some late 1863s and was standard on the first 1868s. And as we talk about these transitional overlaps, I have to now introduce another confusing factor in the Tranter history: serial numbers. For many years, William Tranter would use two continuous serial lines for all of his branded firearms, one for percussion arms, and another line of serials for center fire. All center fire together, mind you. The simple single-action sheath triggers, single-shot parlor guns, and rook rifles, they're all mixed in the serial blocks with, well, not even blocks, the continuous serial number with our gun today. The 1863 Army appeared around 3,600. A few transitionals chambered for center fire appear around 5,700, which is also where the 1868 model seems to emerge for the first time. Scaled back up from the house defense line, these are single and double action 6-shot revolvers, usually chambered for the new 450 Adams centerfire cartridge. Developed for use in converted Beaumont Adams revolvers, this round had been adopted by the British government as the 450 Boxer Mark I. Short, fat, and slow, it still managed to deliver an acceptable thump. It would be the British standard until 1880. Other features of the 1868 Army Tranter include a left side vertical arbor spring, the new 1868 patented swinging ejector rod, which did not fit down inside the arbor. That was a later adaptation by Adams, actually. It was instead kept tensioned at full length outside of the gun, by a flat spring built into its right side. Early examples may have a cupped hammer, but this quickly gave way to a normal firing pin mounted on the hammer itself. The gate swings outward and has an integral latch. The previous model's friction spring has been retained, but now operates on the face of the cylinder instead of its side, likely hiding the wear mark. And finally, the cylinder stops are quite prominent, both scalloped into and jutting out from the cylinder body. The 1868 Armies run up to about 6,000 in the Tranter Uber serial, then another model fills up numbers until 13,000 when they re-emerge. These serials may indicate a progressing date, or concurrent production could have taken place with reserved blocks for batches. I'm not sure. Also, stray pistols with mixed features can appear up and down the serial line thanks to using up spare parts at later dates. Still in 1868, it seems Tranter decided to merge his percussion and centerfire serial lines into one truly uber Tranter serial line. This causes a jump from the very low 13,000s to 30,000. The majority of the 1868 family exist after that jump. Now from here we can discuss probably a dozen unique combinations of features resulting in submodels of the 1868, but let's simplify things. Versions of the 1868 would be produced in several frame sizes. These were dictated by the selected cartridge and the number of chambers in the cylinder, usually 6 or 5 for a more compact handgun. Some of the smallest calibers could be had in 7-chamber cylinders on, say, medium or large frames. Over time, there would also be changes made to the accessory components, like the loading gate and the ejector. The second version of which was again a swiveling rod attached to the front of the frame, but this time it rested under the right side of the cylinder. This design was protected by an 1871 patent. The next ejector was similar, but swiveled on the right side of the frame. Here it's on a 5-shot model, which you can also see does not have raised cylinder stops. This pistol also sports the second loading gate latch with a prominent release button. Next, it appears that Tranter licensed the Adams patent ejector from 1872, frame pivoting like the original Tranter 68, but now recessed in the arbor when tucked away. The earliest versions had a flat-topped head, but we'll see it change a bit on our gun today. Which, with all those details in place, I can finally show you. So let's take a look. Ah, there we go. Tranter's patent, 1868 model, 5-shot 450 double and single action revolver. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means I get to cock the hammer back and then pull the trigger, or I get to pull the trigger through, oh, that's heavy, until the hammer falls. Sorry, I do not want to dry fire this one. It took me a while to get it running. Now, while we're talking about the single double action, I want to point out this little guy, which is an extension off the trigger, often called the trigger horn. It's very indicative of Tranter's revolvers. He liked to recess his sear. Usually, we see it sticking out some, and I suspect the reason he did that is because he was concerned that in this, say, half cock, or it's not really half cock, this is a manual rebounded position. It's effectively a half cock though. In this position, if you have the sear sticking out, you may be able to whack it by accident and drop that hammer. Probably not a huge deal, but you could have a live round there, so better safe than sorry. We'll put this over here. You'd have to reach down in there to trip that sear, so neat. I think that's reinforced by the fact that he put this big old bulky rear trigger guard here, but I can't be sure. He's never really written down why he did it. So we have the final version of the ejector here, which is activated by this particular button here. This is a lever powered by a spring. We release it, we can pull out our rod, we can move it over to the right, at which point, we can open up our spring bias loading gate. This is actually new. I didn't cover this yet because this is the final version of the loading gate, but unlike the others that had the latch up at the top, this one is held in place by a flat spring inside that biases it into one of two positions. I find this to be a little bit weak though, because you can see there's some slop here, and when it's closed, there's a little bit of slop. And to be honest with you, I freshened up that spring and it just distorted right back into this condition. Anyway, when we want to load, we load through our gate, obviously, and we want to unload, we unload through the gate. Now, don't forget your hammer must be in the rebounded position. I'll show you why in a second. And then we'll eject our rod, and we'll manually eject the next case, with our rod. And each time you notice I have to work it back and forth. There's no spring bias. As a matter of fact, it's a little sort of rattly. So no real mechanical advantages there. When we're done unloading, of course, this guy tucks away with a nice little click. So just to reiterate on that, we cannot pull it out without hitting the button, but we can put it back in without hitting the button. So at least there's that. Now, why the heck am I saying be careful about manually rebounding? If you look carefully at the cylinders, or the chambers in the cylinder, actually here's a good example. See all this damage in here, that banging up? What happened was a previous owner did not understand how this gun works, and with the hammer all the way down, they tried to rotate the cylinder. And then they gorillaed it when that didn't work. That damaged both the hammer and the cylinder. You must manually rebound in order to rotate this guy properly for loading and unloading. In this position, the hammer is also held to the rearward, so they're held rearward enough that the firing pin can't make contact with, say, a primer, which makes it safer for loading and unloading. Unfortunately, I had to go chase out all these little burrs before we could film this episode, so be careful with these old guns. Now, I know this barrel is the correct length because we still have the factory engraving of a sort of rope pattern around the muzzle. This is very indicative of a Tranter. In the next position down, there's a little crown over 3 that we're going to talk about later. And despite the fact that we have no lanyard ring, and it looks like there never was one as this is a decorative screw, we still have some military markings right here that again, I'll show you in a moment, but just so you know where they're located on the gun when we get to talking about them, they were in this general vicinity. As far as cool features go, I really want to show you this unusual screw and spring right here. As a matter of fact, let me zoom in. This little guy is there to prevent counter rotation. He's just a friction spring point pushing on the front of the cylinder. As a matter of fact, you should be very careful of him when you take the gun apart. Let's do that now, actually. To remove our cylinder, we just have to first release our ejector like we did before with the lever, and press it again, and you can actually pull on the arbor. Now, if you're slow on the arbor and you don't keep holding down the lever, there is a moment where it holds and therefore will not be lost. Or you can keep holding it down and pull it all the way out. But in this case, let's minimize how many parts we have laying around. With that done, we can now just open up our gate, make sure we're in the half cock, and then our cylinder should, for most revolvers, fall free. But in this case, I'm being very careful, and I'm being careful for a good reason. It's that little spring right there. So let me go ahead and snake this out, and then I'll show you why. Look at this little butthole. I hate him so much. Oh man, I can't tell you how much I hate him, because this is the third one of him I have made since getting this gun. As a matter of fact, when I received the gun, there was no spring in this position. And this is a rough approximation of what it should be that I've handmade, thanks to, by the way, my buddy Jonathan Ferguson over at the Royal Armories, who opened up a whole drawer of these and found, I think, exactly one that still had its original spring. And most of them had replacements that were much bigger and probably field made in more of a wide-headed carrot shape. This is my approximation of what the original shape was from the one example that we saw. I'm probably just a little bit off on the length, but this was working and I didn't want to mess with it because the previous two cracked in attempts to film the gun. And each time they cracked, we had to give up filming and start all over again with another spring. So I ended up making a couple of these actually. Let me go ahead and get this guy out of here so I can show you why he's important, because with him in, the gun's just working. All right, the little guy is out, and I've borrowed this for our demonstration because if we have 5 rounds in the cylinder, we fire 2, let's say. So one went from center over to here to the right because it's rotating clockwise. Now we fire the second one, and therefore the top position is empty. That means there's no weight in these 2 holes. However, there is weight all across the left side of the gun, and maybe just a little bit to the right side of the gun, which means that this cylinder is, if we're holding it, vertically shooting, it means it's biased to want to drop to the left, but we want it to rotate to the right. That's not a problem if the gun is under a constant controlled feed of the cylinder, a controlled rotation of the cylinder. In this case, it's not though. There's a moment in the way the system works in which when we release the trigger and the hand is falling, that the cylinder is no longer under the control of any other mechanism, and therefore gravity will have an effect. So if I go ahead and stick this guy as a sort of a weight in one of these chambers, then I can show you what's going on. So we'll cock, we're all under controlled power, everything's fine. Then we fire, we're all under controlled power, everything's fine, the hand is doing its job. But when I let go, the hand is going to slip off the back of the ratchet teeth in the cylinder just for a moment. These stops will no longer be engaged, and then you can see there's no other stop in this gun, which means, ooh, that reverse rotation. So we can end up in a situation where we're constantly firing the same round over and over and over again. Look at that. We keep shooting the same chamber. That's not good. It certainly made it impossible to film the gun whenever one of those springs snapped, as they seem to want to do quite often. Usually these guns have a flat spring on the arbor that keeps pressure on the cylinder. I'm unsure why it was chosen to put one here. It seems to be sort of the Achilles heel of this design among any of the other problems you might find. Now, something I really love about this gun, despite its era, is that it does have a side plate, and a rather ingeniously built one. Let's go ahead and take it out. With the side plate screw mostly removed, I like to give it a little tap, and it'll push back in. From there, with it nice and loose, I can continue to remove the screw. And you haven't seen it, but the side plate has fallen off into my hand. Hey. Let's flip this over. Now, it's a bit crowded to see what's going on for the mechanism, but check this out. There's that central screw. Normally, that screw, like say on a Colt 1878, would also be the rotating pin for the hammer. But in this case, that is a separate construction. This hammer is still on a rotating pin. That screw is only holding the side plate. As a matter of fact, if I flip it back over, we can see we have a split head screw that is actually serving to hold the hammer if we needed to remove it. But we don't in order to get into the gun to oil and do other maintenance. I had not had to remove it the entire time I've been working on the gun, which is actually stupendous. Now, otherwise, this is sort of a hybrid system where we have to drop this lower trigger guard and everything in order to feed parts out the bottom. Taking off the grip, requires fishing out the springs in the rear. It's really unfriendly in every other way. However, there is something interesting in the way this works. This comes from that, again, earlier patented mechanism. if I push with my hammer, or my trigger, so I go ahead and pull this guy, it's pushing back on the hammer, it's actually pushing on a little extension bar here that has sort of a bird's beak shape to it. See if you can see it appearing and disappearing in that hole, see it? When it pushes up, it pushes until it slips past and then the hammer falls, so that little bird's head beak shape does that. Or if we were to cock the hammer drags the underside of the beak along with us so that we're locked up until we push past and then we're free. In this case though, on single action, we're being held by a sear that you can't see, it's down in there. We'll get a better look at this in our animation. One thing I want to say that's kind of fun about this particular design is this hole that has been that's allowed us to see down in there to see the beak. It's not just there for you to view, it's there for disassembly. When this gun, the way it's put together, is so crowded like this, in order to get that to unhook from the hammer so you can pull the guts out the bottom, you have to take a punch and push it through that hole to drive the beak off of the little lip of the hammer, and then, having removed everything else, you can pull the trigger group out, which I thought was very interesting because, again, if there is a cut or a hole or a shape in an old firearm, it's there for a reason. Again, in this case, disassembly. Now, I don't want to get any deeper into taking this gun apart, so let's go ahead and get Bruno's help with an animation.
First, we'll place our hammer in the rebounded position. This keeps the firing pin out of the path of the cylinder as we manually rotate it into alignment, while loading in 5 rounds of 450 Adams. From this side, we see the hammer resting on its first notch against the sear. This is the rebounded position, keeping the firing pin just off the cylinder and, of course, any primers. Starting with single action, we'll manually cock the hammer back until the sear, powered by its own V-spring, catches in a second notch. Pulling the trigger, we'll see its horn enter the frame and tip the sear, releasing the hammer to spring forward, firing the cartridge. This pawl is the most unique part of the Tranter. Its beak-like shape means it is dragged along by the hammer when we manually cock the action. Pulling the trigger raises it further out of the way of the hammer as it is released by the sear. Alternatively, we can just pull the trigger for double action operation. Here, the pawl's shoulders press the hammer back until it rotates far enough for the pawl to slip past. The pawl is constantly being pressed rearward by this flat spring attached to the hand. Like most revolvers, the hand is raised by the trigger, pressing against the ratchet teeth of the cylinder, causing it to rotate. Still holding the trigger, we can see how it also has a projection that rises up into the path of the cylinder when pulled to the rear. This is the cylinder stop, engaging one of 5 scalloped recessions in the cylinder, preventing over-rotation and, with the hand, keeping the chamber aligned with the barrel. The trigger is returned forward on release by its own V-spring. While not particularly efficient in its use of springs, the Tranter would influence a broad range of revolvers with its sear and pawl arrangement for single and double action operation. To clear our empties, we'll drop the loading gate, withdraw our ejector rod, align it with the chamber, and punch out the spent cases. There is no mechanical assistance here, all manual alignment and operation. Alright, let's go try the real thing.
Honestly, I put a lot of effort into getting this little guy into firing shape. I'm very proud of that footage. Now, I know what you're thinking. Othais just took us on a very long trip for a fairly plain, early centerfire civilian revolver. And you're almost right, if not for the fact that the British Army suddenly found itself very short on handguns. Thanks to a Russian victory in the Russo-Turkish War fought in 1877 and 1878, Britain found itself growing concerned about Russian expansion into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans agreed to British administration of Cyprus, putting their government and troops closer to the potential action. In addition, Britain saw fit to mobilize more troops into Malta, likely as a flexible staging area in case of further conflict. Expansion and mobilization always created demand for further weapons, but in this case, there was an acute problem. The army had largely ignored revolvers up until this point. Yes, they had begrudgingly taken in some Colts during the Crimean War. And in 1856, they trialed some Adams-style double-action percussion pistols. But ultimately, they adopted another single-shot percussion pistol in the end. Over time, the Navy would pursue the matter of revolving handguns on its own, eventually adopting the Adams breech loader and advancing it to Mark III. It wasn't until December of 1877 that the Adams Mark II was approved for cavalry use, the Mark III following in April of 1878. Excellent firearms for the time, there was just one problem with Adams' work. He could only produce them so fast, and suddenly the army went from almost ignoring revolvers to wanting a metric ton of them. Just as they started reaching for cavalry wheel guns, they also expanded their use to general service. The need was probably especially steep with, say, the artillery, let alone specialty troops of various makeup. Adams couldn't keep up with the demand, so emergency purchases were made. Colt 1878s and 450 Adams were adopted as pistol, revolver, breech-loading Colt, non-interchangeable. These were bought up from available inventory, but did not result in a contract, making them few in number. The Tranter 1878, a pistol we'll discuss another day, was contracted for 2,000 initially, but this was suspended with perhaps 1,500 having actually entered service, although more were viewed and probably sent on to the colonies. This became the pistol, revolver, breech-loading Tranter interchangeable. Seems William Tranter was having a little bit of a better time than Colt with the inspectors. Now, the 1878 was definitely a proper service revolver, but they were desperate for handguns, and Tranter did have another Army model on hand, likely piled up in inventory. This was the 1868's final Army model configuration. 6-shot 450 Adams, now with a reinforcing bulge in the cylinder stop region of the cylinder. Estimated purchases range from 165 to 235 model 1868s, with serials generally in the high 59,000 range. Known examples are marked on the right side with WD for War Department and the date 3/79, that's March of 1879. On the right side, you'll likely find a set of broad arrows, tip to tip, which mean that it was sold out of service. And you should definitely see 3 letters, CS over A. The meaning of these has been lost, although one clue, the Colt 1878s were marked similarly, CS over D. That's right, folks, a whole episode for 150 emergency revolvers purchased in 1879 and likely discharged by 1885, except something weird is going on, and it has driven me insane enough to tell all of you. You see, I smell forgotten history. British officials viewed well over 2,000 Tranters. They just only purchased 1,500 for Army and Navy service. And the extras, well, they may have been returned to Tranter, or, as some evidence seems to suggest, they were pushed on out to the colonial forces. 1868 Tranters have turned up with a variety of markings like NZ for New Zealand, although that's more common with the later 78s. My own pistol here has several mysterious markings. The first is this crown over the number 3. It's appeared on a number of British weapons, all the way back to some percussion pistols, but more noticeably on various revolvers and Martini carbines. That symbol is strongly associated with African inventory, although even that has some debate attached to it. The most likely explanation is that the marking comes from the Cape Colony, that's pre-Union of South Africa. This is supported by a number of other unit markings usually found on model 1878 Tranters. The most common marking for the 1868, however, is a bit more confusing. These guns always seem to turn up with SC, followed by a unit number. From my very limited survey, these range from 12, which had a standard barrel length and lanyard loop, up to 259, which, like mine, had no lanyard and a short barrel. All the Crown over 3 Mark 1868 seem to be 5-shot 450 Adams guns, and most have had their markings cancelled and replaced with RMA, although only single digits are known. Now those markings are still a mystery. The only RMA that stands out from that period is the Royal Marine Artillery, but with what little I've been able to dig, it doesn't make a lot of sense for that to be the later unit that it was handed to versus whatever SC was. And the revolvers were colony owned, not proper British government owned. The SC is speculated to mean everything from staff corps to supply company, but I've yet to see any of these initials properly pinned down to a Cape Colony unit. The known serial numbers, however, are pretty telling. They range from 58066 to 59229, and as far as I can tell, this means they were manufactured in the 1878 and 1879 period. And I know what you're all thinking right now. Anglo-Zulu War. This was a conflict resulting from a British ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo, but it may only be a small part of our story today, if my hunch is right. What I am now going to tell you is frankly speculation on my part. Educated speculation, but speculation. It assumes that, yes, this gun is marked by the Cape Colony government, and that it was purchased in 1878 or 1879 like the serial suggests. Now the Zulu War is perhaps too well remembered because it overshadows a number of smaller conflicts that were fought by the actual colonial forces. Specific to the Cape Colony, they had significant martial concerns starting in late 1877. The 9th Shosa War was started over a bar fight at a wedding, sort of. Basically, Governor Henry Bartle Frere wanted an excuse to push for Confederation under the British Empire. To do so, he would need to exploit an opportunity, and one came in a bar fight between peoples of the independent Gallica and Cape Colony allied Fengu. Later that day, the Gallica then attacked a Cape police outpost, which was of course manned primarily by the Fengu. I'm really simplifying this, folks, but the governor attempted to summon the Gallica chief, who refused and rallied his armies. From here, it gets worse. The Cape Colony government didn't want a fight and attempted repeatedly to rein in the British governor. Meanwhile, the Gallica started attacking more outposts, so the Cape government sent in commandos, who soundly defeated the Gallica in 3 weeks and forced a surrender. They took no land and went home. This upset the British governor, who during those 3 weeks demanded occupation of the enemy lands and direct imperial control of the Cape's commandos. He also demanded that the Cape pay in order to bring in the British troops for all of this. Rebuked by the Cape government, he ordered that all black peoples in the Cape be disarmed. This caused, as you may expect, even more trouble, especially because most of the Cape troops were also black. More mistakes were made in the panic. The British sent in troops and attempted a re-invasion of Gallica, which sort of succeeded because the combined Xhosa armies just snuck past the British into the Cape and ransacked everything in sight, while the British just stood in Gallica going, well, I guess we're here. Chaos reigned, and Cape and British officials fought, and order was barely restored by, again, the largely Fengu Cape forces. From there, it became a short guerrilla war until the slow-moving British forces finally took some advice and updated their tactics. The disarmament would become official in 1878 under the Cape Peace Preservation Act. This alone was probably cause for purchasing new firearms for Cape forces, who would now have to disarm the local peoples. Frere would move on to apply the same ambition to the Zulu kingdom in 1879, which is a story we're really not covering except to say that the British defeat at Isandlwana in January did embolden a Baphuti chief by the name of Murosi. I don't care if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I am trying my best. Now, his son and some other tribesmen refused to pay a hut tax negotiated between Basutoland and the Cape government. These men were arrested by the magistrate, but a force of Baphutis liberated them. A troop of Cape mounted riflemen then attempted to reclaim the prisoners, but Murosi managed to repulse them and flee into the mountains, where he successfully outmaneuvered the Cape forces and managed to occupy a fortification that he had been assembling for the last 10 years on a mountaintop. There, he holed up with 300 soldiers and supplies enough to resist a siege. He decided to revolt against the Cape Colony government, refusing to be taxed and declaring independence. From March to November of 1879, Morosi managed to resist 2 assaults from the Cape government forces and allied tribes, each time facing roughly attackers 7 times more numerous than his own defending men. They were finally beaten on the 3rd assault when a mortar was brought up and fired into the fortification for 4 days and nights. Then, just after midnight, Cape forces scaled a fissure and managed a successful attack, scattering Morosi's forces. He was found and shot in a cave shortly after. Now, none of this includes the 1880 gun war with Basutoland, which was a whole other debacle in this cascade of not entirely well thought out decisions. With conflicts like these, where the opposition could hide out or simply evade your forces for weeks or months, or even apply overwhelming numbers on rare occasion, the need for updated firearms was probably fairly pressing. And while the British forces bought up the best equipment for their war on the Zulu, I'm betting the overlooked 5 shots were purchased for the Cape government. Regardless, I do have some proof that Tranter was at least fielded. A quote attributed to an officer writing in a journal known as The Field in 1884 did say the following: "The revolver that I carried through the 3 campaigns of 1877, 1878, and 1879 in South Africa behaved as well as I could wish. This was a double-action revolver by Tranter, and although I carried it over some thousands of miles rough traveling in the saddle, I did not find it fail me once." Alright, while we don't know if it was used by the cavalry, artillery, or just a driver, we do know someone who has shot an 1868 Tranter. So let's go ask her opinion of this diminutive darling. Alright, once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And we have, boy, plenty of room for this.
Definitely do.
This is the smallest revolver we have covered to date. Still a .45.
Yeah.
So maybe Board of Ordnance in US would like it.
That's true. 45 bullet. Yeah, they'd probably be pretty tickled about that.
Now, before I hand you this gun,
Okay.
I'm going to remind everybody, 1868, this is a very early center-fire design. Granted, this particular one was probably made in 1878, which is actually going to show us how much change can come in a decade, I think, as we get to go further into this line of, earlier guns. But let me get that into your hands.
Thank you.
And if you can, give us your first impressions visually, because this is a very unique pistol.
Well, visually, first thing I noticed, talking about the gun size being small, look at that barrel length. That's, 3 inches right there?
Yes.
That is incredibly short. Not what I'm expecting of a military piece.
No, I actually had to double check that gun when I first saw it. A buddy of mine had it. And when I looked down, I went, it has military markings, but it has a 3-inch barrel. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that.
And then a ton of engravings everywhere. But I guess you could have also looked at the engravings on the barrel tip to kind of confirm, be like, oh no, that is definitely the correct length.
Well, that was the beginning of the mystery for me, is because it was marked with the original sort of rope pattern muzzle engraving from Tranter. I was like, nope, that's the original barrel length. It's military marked. Now I'm incredibly curious. Not only because it was marked, but it had been canceled and marked by somebody else. It had been in service.
Right.
And so that started this whole process many months ago. So what else visually?
Well, the grip itself. So it's an interesting shape. It's got a nice curve to it. It's got a good spur here up at the top. But when I first handed it, it's a full finger grip for a really tiny gun. And because for me, I'm thinking like all the automatics we've handled for the series, whenever those have been small, it's usually a small grip accompanied with it. So my pinky's hanging off, or even my ring finger's touching the edge of it. But for this one, no, I've got that and some room. That's pretty fantastic. What do you have with it?
Yeah, even with my adult-sized hand, if I press up against actually this is the knuckle.
Yeah.
I've got all fingers on the gun. Spur.
Sorry.
So I've got all fingers on the gun. And, if I had fatter hands, sure, maybe about half my pinky. If I had real thick fingers, half my pinky might be off.
Yeah.
But for a compact sort of, let's say, pocket size, this 1868 pocket size.
Right.
For a smaller gun,
That's not bad.
That's a full grip.
Right.
That's not too, I'm into it.
Yeah, fair enough. Although I will say, I feel like, and I don't know about you, when I'm holding it in the grip and I just grab it, it feels like the barrel is tipped up a little bit just from naturally gripping it, like 15 degrees. I feel like I have to kind of force it down a little bit.
Yes. So it's an early double action style of grip where it has that full knuckle. The curvature on it is such that I think the expectation is you're supposed to sort of bent arm bring it up.
Oh, that was an old style shooting. Yeah.
Right. And so I think this is what they expected is the bent elbow. If I go to full extension, I'm pointing into the sky.
Yeah, you definitely are.
So for me, when I lock out, I've got to drop.
Bring it down.
And that drop is just a little uncomfortable across the top of my wrist.
Yeah, it's a little bit. And then unfortunately reaching down to that trigger too, that is like double uncomfortable.
That is a very low set trigger.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about the trigger in a second.
No, that's fair. But just looks wise in and of itself, the only other thing that you kind of really notice off the bat is all of this seems kind of busy, but also well cut and contoured. Like it's got a nice little button set here and everything else. Like it looks kind of fancy, but also finicky and potentially flimsy right here. Like it seems like that could be there's a lot going on right there.
It's a commercial look, that's for sure.
Definitely. But that's it for looks.
I'm surprised you didn't comment on the engraving.
Oh, no, we're not to talk about the engraving. I mentioned it before.
Briefly.
Yeah, but it doesn't, that is definitely not something expected. I mean, the engravings are actually quite nice, and they outline the shape of the gun, which is very pretty. They have what is effectively a Lewis pan.
It's a flower.
No, it's a Lewis pan. They were just looking for someone saw the future and put it on this gun. Oh my goodness.
Do you see flowers?
It's a map.
Do you see flower shapes anymore, or do you just see Lewis pans?
I mostly just see Lewis pans, especially for sunflowers. Sunflowers are just Lewis pans now.
You like sunflowers.
I know, but they're Lewis pans. They're beautiful.
All right, so engraved seems maybe a little delicate.
Right.
Short barrel is odd for a military gun, I agree.
Definitely not expecting that.
Good grip. What are we talking about when we start using it? So let's say loading, unloading.
Well, so gate loader, okay. I did notice the gate is kind of bouncy right here at the start, and me, before even using it, was like, is that going to stay while I'm shooting? Because God knows I have had a gate pop open on me before. But no, you get to a certain point where, there's suddenly a giant increase in pressure, and it's not just like you have to get over a little hump. That hump is pretty significant before it finally opens all the way up.
Yeah, how harsh that hump is probably why it's so rattly when it's closed. I think they built it as sort of like a flat and a flat and an oblong, right? And the idea is that you go over center like a detent, and then it pops over the other way. I think their center mark is too deep because I redid that spring. I flattened it back out so that it stayed nice and tight and didn't rattle at all. And then you open and close it 3 times, and it's bent it back over because it's so aggressive on the sort of out of position that it's just shoving that spring over. And it's not the best metallurgy on the springs. It's 1860s.
Yeah.
So...
And then I have to manually rebound the hammer in order to be able to rotate the cylinder, and I can tell somebody did not do that.
Yeah, we talked about a bit of that in the episode. I had a lot of rebuilding to do on that, too.
Oh, yeah. And then, I love this feature. I love that the ejector rod is captured, and you have to depress the spring in order to release it. Although I'm going past my barrel now. Why? It's a short barrel.
We've seen arbor nested ejector rods before. We saw it with the Nagants.
Yep.
We saw it with the Bodeo.
Yep.
I
thought the Bodeo was friction.
It's friction fit, but I'm saying it's nested in the arbor.
Oh, sorry.
So they're tucked away in there.
Yeah.
With the Nagant, you see that you have to rotate it and then pull it out. With the Bodeo, it's just friction. You just pull it out and there's some spring pressure in there.
Yep.
I actually quite prefer this lever system.
Yeah, because you're worried that friction's going to wear off over time, whereas this one, the spring would have to wear out. But it's a pretty positive pop in there, too.
Well, our spring probably did wear out. So that's one thing I didn't get a chance to really rebuild on this gun. I probably should have gone in there and seen if I could modify or stretch that spring or get a new one. Because obviously the ejector rod wandered. Yeah. However, that is definitely a problem that came with 140 odd years versus it being necessarily an original problem to the gun.
Now, the ejector rod is smooth to operate, but it is very flimsy. It feels like it definitely can just easily wobble up in here.
Can you bind it by accident?
That's what I'm trying to do. I was playing with it while you were talking, and no. I'm trying to bind it, honestly. There's a little bit of a notch right here from where it's clear the spring rests against it when it's locked into place inside the arbor. And I'm trying to see if that would bind any.
Nothing.
And it's more that it's not 100% smooth for the rod. Like, I guess it could be a little more polish in there, and it would probably be just like super slick. But no, it's more like it's just I could just accidentally maybe pry it or put horizontal pressure on it or vertical pressure on it, and probably put a little extra pressure against the sides and edges and then cause it to bind a little bit, but it doesn't bind all the way at all.
Yeah. I find this to be just a very rudimentary ejector. Pre-Abity, so the cylinder doesn't index itself. There's no detents to help you find the spot like you would on like an 1895 Nagant. It just rolls. And so I have to look at what I am doing in order to load and eject this gun. Whereas there's other guns that either have Abity systems or even just detents in the ejector so that you feel the ejector sort of click down, click out, click down, click out.
Right.
And with those little clicks, you don't think about it, but they really help you to know where you are in the gun.
Yeah, it's a good indicator process.
Yeah, you don't have to look at what you're doing so much as you can feel your way through it, and this provides none of that.
No, if I were operating this in the dark, I guess I would use the end of the barrel as my gauge for where I am.
Yeah, or you'd be like touching the edges of stuff. Like you'd be really feeling your way around.
Yeah, exactly.
That lever, by the way, is also for taking the gun apart, which we saw earlier.
Right, it retains the arbor, right?
Yes, and I really love that sort of dual use. I think that's a really smart idea. I think it's brilliant in this gun.
Sure, makes sense. And then the only other thing we really haven't talked about in the ergonomics is about just how dense this gun feels. It feels like it's either really thick steel or it's iron. Do you know?
It's iron.
You think so?
I can't say I haven't done like a scrape test on it or anything, but it is an 1860s gun. It's out of a handmade workshop. Like Tranter was a very advanced man for his time, but he wasn't necessarily going to change material sciences overnight for a gun that didn't have any military contracts. This is an iron gun.
Yeah, for how small it is, I just didn't expect that density to come with it.
Yeah. So, I guess that's really about it, except for maybe, did you have any weirdness around that little trigger doodad?
Oh, the little knob sticking out back here?
Yeah. Did you notice it at all?
Well, the thing is, I don't notice it when pulling the trigger, but I have to wonder if potentially if you were to drop this and it hit just the right way, how strong is this metal back here? I mean, I guess did they put it onto the trigger or did they make it
Is it brazed on or is it like milled out?
Actually,
I'm not sure.
It looks like it was attached, if I'm looking correctly.
I don't know of any that have broken off, but that may be survivor's bias. I have seen more than a few dozen of these guns now, just from my research.
But it is critical to the gun functioning. So if that did snap or even shorten by a little bit, you just wouldn't have a functioning gun.
Right. It's necessary for the sear in single or double, because if that sear is allowed to ride the hammer, then if the trigger doesn't hold back the sear and the hammer falls in double, it's going to catch the rebound notch. And the rebound notch isn't going to allow it to hit down on a primer. So it is sort of almost like another safety too in that regard, in that you have to have the trigger to the rear in order for the hammer to fall.
Yeah.
And then I think that's really it, other than just the complete lack of a lanyard, which I guess
that's what I'm looking at now. I'm just like, can you take that screw out and replace it and put a lanyard in there?
That's what they would have done for the military contract ones. And it's another reason why these came out of just commercially available pistols, because you think you would have at a very minimum added a lanyard if it was a known contract versus just grabbing what you can grab.
Gotcha.
So,
okay. Well, that feels like pretty much it.
No, I guess we're down to shooting it.
Yeah.
And this is... May and I have had a conversation about this before the show. This is two guns.
Okay.
Because there's the gun you're shooting single action, and then there's the gun you're shooting double action.
It definitely is two in that respect.
Can you start us with single action?
So, I have to pull the hammer back. Hooray, I suddenly have sights, because guess what? You can't see the sights when the hammer's forward. That kind of sucks. And then...
How are those sights?
They're actually surprisingly good. So it's like a shark fin front sight with a deep cut V-notch rear. Sorry, I somehow made three words one.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's actually surprisingly good read. Like, I definitely enjoy it when I see it.
Right.
When eventually I see it.
Okay.
But yeah, for single action, oh my God, I actually tied up for a second there. There we go. Got the hammer all the way back. And then the trigger, I would say, for single action is not light. It's not like one of those, touch them, it goes off. Like, it isn't one of those. It definitely has like a medium amount of weight to it. So it doesn't feel like you could accidentally pull the trigger on this guy very easily.
Yeah, I mean, you could, like, if you had it cocked open and you just sort of like, blah, 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 it'll go off.
Sure.
But there's some resistance even in single action because it has a sort of tapered cut to the sear when it meets the hammer. And so it needs to slip back just a few degrees before it will then drop.
But it's barely any travel, so it's actually quite nice and very smooth for the single.
Yeah, it's a deliberate single action trigger though, which is honestly good. It almost feels like it is an intentionally military single action trigger.
I don't like the hammer so much when I get it pulled back though, because like it feels very soft for its touchdown.
No, the sear engagement is very gentle.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I don't know if it's just the shape in there.
It's mushy.
But when the sear clicks over, normally when you cock a hammer back, you can feel the click very positively.
And it's done.
Yeah, and this one sort of is just like click, and it's very soft.
Yeah,
and you're
just like is it there? Like you can even see me hesitate on range when I pull that hammer back and just. I'm like, is it down? Okay, I definitely let it go gently just to make sure it definitely was all the way back.
And it doesn't help that this gun was so gunked up that when we originally picked it up, when you went all the way to the rear, it would just slip past the sear position randomly. Like it wasn't fully engaging because of all the grit in there.
Yep.
And so you could just tap the hammer and it would drop it.
Yep.
And so that was a big clean operation to get that running again.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's pretty much it for single. For double, like we said, no sights until I'm pulling the trigger. So literally you can see me adjusting my sight, the gun, as I'm pulling the trigger. So I'm like, oh, there's my sight. Okay. And I usually end up lowering it a little bit, I think, just out of habit. But I want everyone to see in this camera. Watch this trigger. Look how far back that is just for single. It goes a little bit further for double. Mm-hmm. That's crazy to me. That is such a long travel point, and I'm having to reach down for it. It's a little bit awkward.
Yeah, your finger's down, and then you're tucking into your hand a little bit more than you want to.
Yeah.
And it starts to hurt.
Yeah. My favorite part was that it kind of changed on me for how much strength I needed to pull, because it was somewhere, all of a sudden it would go from medium light-ish to medium heavy. And I'd be like, whoa, wait.
On a rare occasion, it would flat out lock up.
Right. That was fun. And then I just had to let go of the trigger and then pull all the way through and blah, 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 blah.
This is a problem with iron frame guns, because this one, as far as I know, has never been updated with a steel plug like you saw the Bodeos, right? So the Italian Bodeos, they had problems with the iron getting deformed by the recoiling case.
Right.
So they drill it out, they put in a steel plug, finish it back off, and now it's recoiling against hardened steel. This appears to be iron all the way through, so that breech face is pockmarked with previous rounds going off. And they haven't necessarily done the contouring either to allow the spent cases or even the live ones to not catch any marks that are already in the breech face, because it's just a level breech face. It's not like sort of turned away.
Sure.
So while you're pulling it through there, maybe you fired it and that first round is now sort of partially embedded just a little bit, and it adds a bunch of weight, and then all of a sudden it skips past and whoop, your trigger jerks.
Yep.
Or there's other pot marks or things where the next incoming round is hitting the lip of something. There's little deformities that means that those rounds jostling in there are like catching and uncatching on surfaces, and it's changing your trigger pull.
As you're pulling, that's great. I enjoyed that. It keeps you on your toes. Definitely.
Yeah, but we definitely had a couple lockups even just from like a case hitting at the wrong angle and just being like, nope, don't want to go. And it's a lot of leverage and your fingers turked all the way around and you're out of space to really force on it. And you have to just let it go. And now that cylinder, you've missed the round. And then that's a huge pain.
If you're unlucky, if you're lucky, you just kind of did a little touch and you're like, oh, thank God it's still there.
Okay. So the gun goes bang.
Right.
How was recoil?
It actually wasn't that bad. It just sounded really stout.
Bark.
Yeah, it's like a tiny dog with a guttural bark to them.
Right.
It's like, good God, what is that coming out of that dog?
Right. No, it was the first gun we shot that afternoon.
Yeah.
And, you have these little black powder 450. Is that your reaction to 450 Adams?
Well, I mean, to be fair, it's a 45 bullet, so like it's actually
fat.
It's pretty fat.
But there's this little stubby case.
Little bitty kiss.
Especially for a black powder cartridge too. That's not a lot of case length.
Right.
So they're kind of anemic, but they're still 45.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about where this comes from later. This was part of the whole Adams revolver, British. It's a thing. But they kind of work out for a pocket gun because they're so small. And you had a big 45, so you get a 5-shot 45 with this little short case.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, and so you just dump all the black powder you can get in there, you know, and then...
Surprisingly, though, the recoil wasn't that bad, though. I was expecting a little bit worse, but
well, you're doing
okay.
Short case, so lower capacity, black powder.
Yeah.
The gun's,
I guess I just see the bullet size and I'm like, oh, okay, it's definitely going to have more oomph to it.
Right. Well, the gun's small, but it's heavy. So medium?
Yeah. It's
I still saw you kind of...
It's about medium.
Yeah, the grip's not helping you, I guess.
No.
But,
thank God for the knuckle. If the knuckle weren't there, I'd be slipping and sliding everywhere.
You still kind of had a little slide.
A little bit, yeah.
And I guarantee you know what it is? It's the full arm extension thing. So you go to full arm extension, you're not shooting it this way, right?
No.
So since you're not shooting it this way,
That'd be weird.
when you go to full arm extension, you come off the knuckle some.
A little bit.
And when you shoot it, it slips back into the knuckle. And then you have to pop it back up. So I saw you change your grip a few times.
You automatically have to change it to bring the gun down a little bit anyway, too. So it's...
Probably, next time we go out, we need to take this thing and just let you shoot it like this.
Oh, God, I'll try it.
Well, actually, technically
I'll try everything at least once.
Yeah. So, you heard it, folks.
Oh, boy. That's going to be a comment.
Recoil not bad.
No, not bad.
Follow-up shots probably would have been better if the mechanism behaved.
All right, and on top of that, I had my sights from the very start. That'd be nice to not have to adjust my shot while I'm pulling the trigger. That'd be good.
I love that you're playing peekaboo with the sights.
And it's like, there you go. Where are you? There you are.
Wait, I'm your sights. Ready?
There I found you. No, I got you. But that's pretty much it. Yeah.
No other follow-up?
Well, for recoil.
It belched smoke and fire.
I mean, so that's the funny part is that you see fire coming out from all sides of this thing.
Oh, yeah.
Front of the cylinder,
I'm surprised you
rear
didn't
of the
think it had
cylinder.
a catastrophic failure the first round because it's just blowing smoke and fire in every
I love
direction.
that we did the high speed in like the dark.
Yeah, oh yeah.
That was pretty good actually, just seeing how much fire came out from everywhere.
Yeah, there's probably another reason that there's not that much recoil is that you're blowing all your powder in every direction.
I was surprised I didn't notice any heat, but I guess it just happens so fast you just don't really feel it. I mean, I didn't lose any hair.
Yeah, it's probably there and gone.
I don't have any missing knuckle hair or anything.
Yeah, how much knuckle hair do you normally have?
I mean, let's not talk about that.
Okay. So, I guess we're kind of getting into that. Well, actually, hold on. Before we go any further, let me explain something about this gun. Because Mae's about to give her opinion on how it operates, but I need to make something very clear.
The horror story that was this gun for you? Is that what you're
Yeah.
Okay.
This gun did not run when we got it in.
No.
At all. This gun was out of time. The hand wasn't properly engaging. The sear spring was gone. Somebody had destroyed the hammer's firing pin by bashing it into the cylinder chambers so bad that the chambers were messed up. Oh God, what else was there? There's a couple other little things. The gate was misaligned entirely, so I had to go in there and redo the spring for the gate.
Did you talk about the arbor pin? Or not the arbor pin, the arbor spring?
Arbor spring.
Didn't you have to adjust this spring?
No, I said I should have adjusted the arbor spring.
You should have,
because it ended up letting go on range, and it turns out I needed to do that too, and I never...
Slowly pushing the ejector on past the barrel.
Turns out I needed to do that. But, so this took a little work, and then it had some problems where it's like, okay, the hand's not long enough, so you extend the tip of the hand. But then, because you extend the tip of the hand, you don't realize that the way this gun works is it cams over the ratchet, and then the width of the hand counts too.
Right.
And when you extend the tip of the hand, you flatten the hand a little bit, so now it's out of time in a totally different way.
Yep.
So it's like...
Have to get it just right.
So you either have to go in there and like hit it with, I don't know, solder or weld it up or puff it up in some way or bash this other dimension and maybe make it worse in another way you're not predicting. So I ended up using a shim. Like the gun ran with a shim in it just fine because all I had to do was
Did you sign it?
The shim was literally a playing card because it was just the thickness enough to keep the hand pushed over.
Playing cards can come
where
in
it needed to be. Oh yeah, playing card shims are great.
Yeah.
So it's still technically the gun itself inherently is not in time, but with that little shim, that's all it took to kind of and hold it right where it needed to be. Ran like a champ that way.
Yep.
So, but just so much of this gun was sort of hammered on and rebuilt internally.
And then that pressure spring up front, the other side, you've replaced that, 3 times?
Oh yeah, this little front pressure spring. I did mention that in the episode, the resistance spring.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was number 3 or number 4.
This is number 3.
See, even you are having to question it. Once you get past 2, you're like, oh crap, I have to keep count now.
So the short answer is the internals of this gun, don't get me wrong, somebody had been abusive towards it at some point.
Right.
And it took me a lot to chase out the corners of the chambers and everything else. However, the fact that all happened is because this gun is iron. And I suspect some of the parts are steel, but they're not the hardest steel even if they are.
So even if somebody hadn't abused it, you're saying that the potential for this gun to get to this state is not that hard?
These guns are more likely to be found out of time or with broken components than other guns.
Okay.
Not necessarily of the era, but of that region in the era, it's pretty normal because most of them were made out of softer steel and iron. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. This is indicative of a Birmingham gun. You got to remember, this is when Birmingham was essentially Liège or Ibar. There was a bunch of independent gunsmiths everywhere. Quality varied wildly. Not wildly, because they formed a trade union and tried to clamp down on that, right? And they started proofing their own. But Tranter was actually at the top of the game. So this is a very good quality, handmade, essentially guild system gun, right? So this is a gun that is a single, it's a triple action center fire modern revolver. Okay. Right?
Sure.
Except it's made entirely as if it was from the 1840s or 50s, right? They're using mostly old Civil War and pre-Civil War technology.
So it's got a few toes in the past.
Right. So this is the beginning of the new era. Okay. And then manufacturing, steel quality and manufacturing right as this gun's being made. As a matter of fact, the very next gun from Tranter, and we're going to talk about it, I managed to get a hold of one. That gun, I really suspect, was built in a totally different factory because it has a totally different behavior internally. And I mean it in terms of just how soft or hard it feels. And we'll see it. This will be a whole episode. Neat. But I just want to point out, this is sort of the last of the old world iron guns. So with that in mind, this gun never made it to World War I.
Okay, so we're officially out of the small arms of World War I primer.
I guess so, yeah, because this is not a World War I firearm. Instead, we want the context on whether or not you'd be comfortable using a gun like this. Let's say from 1878, even though this is from 68, the first time it really got used was 78.
Sure.
And all the way up to, let's say, 1900. So you're talking about, for the British especially, Zulu to Boer War.
But I've got like other options out by then, right? Like the Enfield Mark 1 and 2.
Yes, well, by not 78, but right away in 1880, you got the Enfield Mark 1. And then if we walk it all the way up to 1900, let's give it a lifespan up to 1900.
Sure.
You'd be seeing the U.S. adopting the new Army and new Navy. You'd see the Webley Mark 1 and stuff rolling into Britain. But
so we're sticking it to just revolvers only.
Yeah, well, no, but there's no real automatics in that period. Just the Borchardt and the C96.
1899, but you know.
I mean, barely. Italy, okay, fine. But yeah, it's mostly revolvers. And then honestly, I'm naming some exceptional pieces. Those are the swing out cylinder and the top brakes, those are exceptional. Most armies are still going to be fielding gate loaders.
Right.
So, like the Rosengosser 1898. That would have been right at the end of that too. Sure. Yeah. So, in those sort of compatriots, how do you feel about this gun in terms of a Marshall revolver?
I want to be pretty clear here on this guy. This is still better than a percussion cap gun. This is still
period,
hands down. But I am concerned about the condition of the piece because we've had pieces from this era on the show before. We've shot them, and they've looked worse externally, but they performed better than this one.
I'm struggling to think if we've had something as far back as 68. Now, we know this one was made in 78.
Yeah.
But it is one of the oldest guns we've shot. It is. The problem is that extra 10, maybe 20 years?
The next step to making it that much better?
No. I mean, just in terms of wear.
Oh.
Like, because it's not like it got used the whole time. It probably got about as much use as any of the other old military revolvers that we've handled. Because externally, it's not beat to death. It's just internally, it's
So you're wondering if we just took a time step back 20 years into this gun, literally from now, would it be significantly better than it is now?
Yeah, it'd be the same thing. It'd been sitting in a drawer the same way as always.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been that different.
No, the damage I saw did not look like it was done by a recent gunsmith. It looked like somebody, 50 years ago trying to get it running. So, I don't know. I have a feeling that a lot of those things broke honestly in that gun and that it wasn't just somebody monkeying around with it because I don't see the tool marks I would see from
somebody trying to do their own thing. Yeah. Right.
So...
See, I've got my concerns about that because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it would wear out faster.
Yeah.
The question comes down to whether or not it would run for a campaign. So if you were issued this in 78 and expected to use it for, let's say, 5 years.
Didn't they have a 6-shot version, also a longer barrel option, too?
I mean, you can consider, but that was what the actual British...
Sorry to get you off topic. I just want to make sure
the War Department purchased 6-shot long barrels with lanyard rings. And you can answer this question either as this or if you had the extra shot in the longer barrel. I think you'd prefer the extra shot in the longer barrel.
Well, no, duh, yeah.
Yeah. So, but in either case, it's the same mechanically. Does this feel like something that you would use 1878?
Maybe. It's hard to think about, but there is a possibility. Like, I don't think I'd be jazzed about it, but I don't think I would necessarily be enthused about it either.
I suspect it would hold out.
That was the same word.
I think that gun would run for 5 years of service.
Yeah.
I don't think it would make it for 30 years of service.
I think 30 years in, you'd be looking at some parts starting to show some wear already.
But if I was given that gun brand new and sent out to do a campaign for 2-3 years.
Yeah.
The number of times I'm honestly going to fire it is fairly low. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be a 45 caliber.
That's what I was just thinking.
Compact 5-shot right with me in an era where, I mean, I'm trying to think of comparables. A lot of people are still issuing single actions.
I mean, I'd take this over a single action any day of the week.
Yeah, if you're the U.S. Army, you've picked up a single action in 1873. That's 5 years after this gun was invented. Mm-hmm. That's kind of weird to think about, too.
Yeah.
The single action Army is 5 years after this gun was developed.
That's weird.
And this gun's just a refinement of a gun that came 5 years before it. Mm-hmm. So that should tell you technologically how advanced it is. I would take, I'm going to make people mad, as delicate as the single action Army can be in certain components, I'd probably take this over a single action Army.
Yeah, I could see it.
I wouldn't be as comfortable with it out to, say, 50 yards.
No.
But if it's, you know, if I got to
get
worry...
the longer barrel.
Well, no, it's a more powerful cartridge. The gun's easier to sight, blah, blah, blah.
No.
But I think if I'm dealing with somebody at under 30 feet, I'll take this because I got double action. Double action kicks the crap out of single action when you're in a panic.
Yeah, speed is going to be everything.
Right.
I agree.
But the question is, does it beat every single action? What about your Russian?
In terms of speed, yeah, it still beats it.
Yeah, but is it more comfortable? Because it depends on what kind of fight you get into. If I'm in the Boer War, where it's very unlikely that I'm going to have a guy within 30 feet, I'll take the most accurate long-barreled pistol I can get a hold of.
You take the Russian.
Right. I want a heavy cartridge. I want whatever because there's a chance I'm going to get into a fight with somebody, 50 yards behind a rock.
Right.
But in terms of somewhere where I think somebody might close in on me close, I'll take that.
Yeah. Same there.
Yeah.
I'd be the same way.
Always ready.
Yep.
But that assumes that it will hold together for those 5 years. So it's one of those guns that has a little bit of a low trust scenario in it.
Kinda, yeah, unfortunately. But that's okay. I think for the 5 years I could expect it to be okay. I think after that I'd start looking at it funny.
What's your biggest pain point other than just the trigger not being great? Is there anything else that really felt bad?
I mean, aside from the hammer feeling a bit soft, I didn't quite care for that. I didn't care how flimsy the ejector rod felt.
Okay.
No, not really.
The sights didn't even stick out enough, does it?
What? I said the sights were great.
No, but they're hidden when you're in double action.
Yeah.
It still doesn't that seem like the sort of thing that, like, because to the viewer, they're going to go, it would drive me crazy to not be able to see my sights.
I mean, yeah, I can't disagree with that. I just didn't think of it off the bat.
But did you feel like it was affecting your ability to hit a man-sized target at 30 feet like we do?
Not at 30 feet, no. But that would just mean I would be hitting higher on the body's person. The angle that it goes up is something like 10 degrees or something like that. It's not that drastic.
Okay, I just make sure I'm luring it out of you because I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, how can you not have sights on a double? And it's like, well, at 30 feet, you just... Point shooting is dead, right? Nobody wants to discuss it. But at this era, point shooting was still a very valid, especially the moment you start having multiple rounds in a gun. Mm-hmm. We see this era as sort of the birth of point shooting where people are like, I just drew and I just dumped the cylinder at him because 2 of them are going to hit. Yep. And if you can work it fast and just dump rounds before he can take aim and fire, there's a certain short-rangedness at which dumping the magazine's better. Mm-hmm. And people don't like to talk about that now because we think of a very crowded society. We think of, hitting someone behind someone. We think of all sorts of other scenarios.
Right.
But back then, there was way more room. Everything was spread out.
Yep.
The walls were hardwood. They'd stop a bullet half the time. Mm-hmm. It wasn't drywall. It wasn't paper. It wasn't whatever. It's this weird mentality back then of just like, boom, boom, boom. And then if you hit them, you hit them. I mean, I've seen World War II era training films where it's like they're teaching you to use the 1911 one-handed. And they're just pointing that gun from the hip and just firing half the mag. Because it's like, what are you going to do? You came out behind a rock. You got time to aim it in the middle of the night? Nah, just go ahead and you'll get
it out. Get it done. I agree.
Yeah. Do you think that's useful in that role?
Probably, yeah. I can't see it not being. The only annoying thing would just be the chain dip and the trigger pull randomly. But it's brand new. I don't think it would probably be doing that.
That's true. You wouldn't necessarily have the scrapes.
Yeah, so that'd probably be fine.
Okay. Well, now we know. Yeah. And if anybody has a nicer 1868 to send over, maybe we'll try that.
Yeah, I'd be willing to give it a shot.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, we're going to wrap out the episode. I'm going to consider that Mae's final word.
Yeah.
Updates are after the credits. And otherwise, you guys have a good one.
Night, everybody. Hey guys, today's show is the last of 2021. Thank you all for the support this year, and we hope you'll join us again for 2022. Happy New Year, everyone!